The chamber was silent except for the soft hum of the translation devices. 300 representatives from across the galaxy sat in their designated sectors, and every single one of them looked exhausted. The emergency session had been going on for 6 hours, and they were no closer to a solution than when they started. Ambassador Zilenth of the Orine stood at the central podium, his blue skin looking almost gray under the harsh lights. He was old by galactic standards, having served on the Council for 40 cycles, but he had never seen anything like this. The holographic display behind him showed the grim statistics in cold clinical numbers that somehow made the horror worse. 847 cycles. That was how long the war had been going on. The Vathara Collective and the Krell Dominion had been killing each other for longer than some civilizations had existed. The numbers scrolling across the screen were almost impossible to comprehend. 4 trillion dead, 200 worlds completely destroyed, their atmospheres burned away or their surfaces turned to radioactive glass. Hundreds more planets rendered barely habitable, their populations reduced to scattered refugees. Zilenth touched a control, and the display shifted to show a map of the affected region. The war zone was a spreading stain of red across the galactic arm, and it was growing. Slowly but steadily, the conflict was pushing toward Council space. Within 50 cycles, maybe less, peaceful worlds would start dying. "We have tried everything," Zilenth said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "We have sent our best diplomats. We have offered economic incentives beyond measure. We have threatened sanctions, blockades, even military intervention. Nothing works. Nothing even slows them down." A murmur ran through the chamber. Everyone knew this already, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way that reports and briefings never could. Councillor Thrain of the Moxari shifted his massive bulk in his seat. "Perhaps it is time to accept that some conflicts cannot be resolved. We should focus our efforts on containing the war, building defensive barriers around Council space." "That is surrender," snapped Councillor Vree, her feathers ruffling in agitation. "We are the Galactic Council. We are supposed to maintain peace. If we abandon the Vathara and Krell to their fate, what does that say about us?" "It says we are practical," Thrain rumbled. "We cannot save those who do not wish to be saved." Zilenth raised his hand for silence. "There may be another option. One that many of you will find unconventional." The murmuring grew louder. Zilenth pulled up a new file on the display. The image showed a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star in one of the outer spiral arms. Earth. Next to it appeared an image of the species that called it home. Humans. The reaction was immediate. Several councillors made sounds of disbelief. Others leaned forward with interest. Humans were something of a curiosity in galactic politics. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 83 cycles ago, making them the newest members of the Council by a significant margin. They were also considered somewhat problematic. The humans. Councillor Vree sounded incredulous. They are barely more than children in galactic terms. Their own planet was divided into hundreds of warring factions until recently. How could they possibly help? "That is exactly why they might help," Zilenth said quietly. He pulled up another display, this one showing Earth's history. The images were disturbing. Battlefields covered in bodies, cities reduced to rubble, weapons of terrible destructive power. Humans have been at war with each other for their entire recorded history. 10,000 years of almost continuous conflict, wars over territory, resources, ideology, religion. They have killed each other with stones, with metal, with fire, with weapons that could crack open their own planet. "And this is supposed to recommend them?" Thrain asked. "They stopped," Zilenth said simply. "Not completely, not perfectly, but they stopped. For the last 80 cycles, they have maintained a general peace across their entire species. No major wars. No extinction-level conflicts. They learned how to step back from the edge." The chamber fell silent. Zilenth continued, his voice gaining strength. "Every species on this council achieved interstellar travel through cooperation and unity. The Orine never had wars. The Moxari resolved their conflicts through ritual combat. The Zelix achieved hive mind consensus. We approached the Vathara-Krell war with the assumption that rational beings will eventually choose peace." He gestured at the image of Earth. "Humans are not rational in the way we are. They are emotional, chaotic, often self-destructive. But perhaps that is what we need. Perhaps it takes a species that truly understands endless war to recognize how to end one." Councillor Miss of the Zelix Collective spoke up, her voice harmonizing with itself in the way of hive minds. We have reviewed their admission files. Humans have a concerning history of violence. Their psychological profiles show high levels of aggression, tribalism, and emotional volatility. These are not traits we associate with peacemakers. With respect, Counselor, these are exactly the traits the Vathara and Krell possess. Sealanth replied. We have been trying to reason with them as we would reason with each other. It has not worked. The Vathara believe that compromise is crystalline imperfection, a flaw in their structure. The Krell view peace as evolutionary weakness, a surrender of their adaptive superiority. They are not being irrational by our standards. They are being irrational by any standards. He pulled up footage from the war zone. A Vathara city, its crystal towers shattered. A Krell bioship broken and dying in space. Civilians fleeing through burning streets. Children, or the equivalent of children, crying over bodies. The council representatives watched in uncomfortable silence. This is happening right now, Sealanth said. While we debate and discuss and analyze, beings are dying. They have been dying for 847 cycles, and they will continue dying unless we try something different. Even if we agree, Counselor Vree said slowly, what makes you think the humans would accept? They have shown little interest in council affairs beyond trade and scientific exchange. This would require a significant commitment. Sealanth allowed himself a small smile. I have studied humans extensively during my time overseeing their integration into council space. They have a peculiar trait. When they see suffering, even suffering among strangers, many of them feel compelled to act. They call it empathy or compassion, or sometimes just giving a damn. It is not universal among them, but it is common enough. If we present this as a humanitarian crisis, I believe they will respond. And if they fail? Thrain asked. If they make things worse? How could they possibly make things worse? Sealanth spread his hands. The Vathara and Krell have been massacring each other for longer than most of us have been alive. They are not going to stop on their own. Our methods have failed completely. At this point, we have nothing to lose by trying something unprecedented. The debate continued for another 2 hours. Arguments were made for and against. Some counselors worried about setting a precedent, inviting such a young species to mediate a crisis of this magnitude. Others pointed out that the traditional hierarchy of galactic politics was clearly not working. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Sealanth had hoped but wider than he had feared. 167 votes in favor. 128 against. 5 abstentions. The motion passed. Sealanth felt something loosen in his chest. It might not work. It probably would not work. But at least they were trying something new. He composed the message carefully, knowing that human diplomacy valued directness over flowery language. The message was simple. To the United Nations of Earth, the Galactic Council requests your assistance in mediating a conflict that has claimed trillions of lives over 8 centuries. We have exhausted all traditional diplomatic avenues. We are asking for your help because you understand something we do not. You know what it means to have endless war. And somehow you found a way to stop. Please help us give that gift to others. The message was sent through quantum communication channels. On Earth, in the massive glass and steel building that housed the UN Galactic Affairs Office, alarms began to sound. Within minutes, the message was being analyzed by experts. Within an hour, it was on the desk of the Secretary General. Within a day, it was being debated in emergency sessions across every continent. The response came faster than Sealanth expected. Humans, he was learning, did not like to wait when they thought people were dying. We accept. 2 words, but they changed everything. Sealanth stood alone in his quarters that night, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Vathara and Krell were still fighting. Ships were firing. Soldiers were dying. Civilians were running for their lives. And now, for the first time in 847 cycles, something genuinely new was about to enter that equation. He thought about the human histories he had studied, the wars they had survived, the peace they had built, fragile and imperfect as it was. He thought about a species that had come within moments of destroying itself completely, and then stepped back from the edge. Maybe it would work. Maybe these strange, emotional, chaotic beings could see something that the logical, rational council had missed. Maybe their experience with darkness gave them unique insight into finding light. Or maybe they would fail just like everyone else had failed. But at least now there was a chance. A small one. Unlikely and unprecedented, but a chance nonetheless. In the war zone, a Vathara destroyer fired on a Krell colony ship. 3,000 beings died in the explosion. Neither side reported it. Incidents like this happened dozens of times per day. It was just another moment in a war that had been going on so long that nobody could remember why it started. But on Earth, in a dozen different cities, people were already preparing. Scientists and diplomats, soldiers and social workers, historians and psychologists. They were gathering data, studying files, learning everything they could about two species that had been killing each other since before humanity had invented writing. Xylanth did not know it yet, but the humans were not approaching this as a diplomatic problem to be solved. They were approaching it as a wound to be healed. And that difference, small as it seemed, was going to change everything. The war had been going on for 847 cycles. It was about to end. Not quickly, not easily, not without pain and setback and moments of despair, but it was about to end, because humanity was coming. The space station called the Fulcrum hung in the darkness between territories, exactly equidistant from both Vethara and Krell space. It was a neutral zone established by the Council decades ago, back when they still had hope that proximity might lead to dialogue. The station was massive, built to house thousands of diplomats, but most of it sat empty now. Nobody wanted to be this close to the war. Xylanth stood in the observation deck watching the human ship approach. The UNSS Persistent Hope was not what he expected. Council ships were elegant things, designed with aesthetics in mind as much as function. The human vessel was blocky and practical, covered in sensor arrays and communication dishes. It looked like something built to work rather than to impress. The ship docked with a series of heavy clangs that echoed through the station. Xylanth made his way to the receiving bay, accompanied by a small contingent of council observers. They had all seen human before, of course, but there was still a sense of curiosity. This was humanity's first major diplomatic mission beyond their own solar system. The airlock cycled open. The first person through was a woman of medium height with dark hair, pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple gray suit that looked almost austere, compared to the elaborate robes of the council representatives. She walked with confidence but not arrogance, her eyes taking in everything. Ambassador Xylanth. She extended her hand in the human greeting gesture. Dr. Sarah Chen, Conflict Resolution Specialist. Thank you for requesting our assistance. Xylanth touched her hand briefly, still getting used to the human custom. Thank you for coming, Dr. Chen. I must admit, we expected a larger delegation. Oh, we brought plenty of people, Chen said with a slight smile. But I wanted to introduce the core team first. She gestured behind her as three more humans emerged from the airlock. This is Colonel James Okafor, retired from the African Union Peacekeeping Forces. A tall man with graying hair and calm eyes nodded a greeting. He moved with the easy grace of someone who had spent decades in military service. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, psychologist specializing in intergenerational trauma and post-conflict recovery. A smaller woman with sharp, intelligent eyes bowed slightly, and Marcus Webb, community mediator from Chicago. The last member was younger than the others, maybe in his early 30s, with close-cropped hair and watchful eyes that seemed to catalog everything. Xylanth looked at the four humans and felt his confusion growing. Forgive me, but we expected military strategists, perhaps senior diplomats. You brought social workers? Several of the council observers shifted uncomfortably. It was a direct statement bordering on rude by galactic standards. But Chen just smiled wider. We brought people who understand conflict, Ambassador. Not just how to fight wars, but why they start and how they end. She pulled out a data pad. Your briefing materials were very thorough. Thank you for that. But I need to make a request that might seem unusual. Of course, Xylanth said carefully. We need complete historical archives from both civilizations, not just military records or diplomatic transcripts. We need cultural materials. Music, art, literature, children's stories, religious texts, oral histories, everything you have. One of the council observers, a Muxari named Thrain, rumbled forward. We have already analyzed all available data. The relevant information has been extracted and provided in your briefing. With respect, Counselor, you analyze data, Chen said. We need to understand people. There's a difference. Thrain looked like he wanted to argue, but Xylanth raised a hand. It will be done. Is there anything else? Yes, Colonel Okafor spoke up. His voice was deep and measured. I'd like permission to visit the front lines. Not the command centers or strategic positions. I want to see the actual fighting, talk to the soldiers if possible. That is extremely dangerous, Zilenth said. The combat zones are unpredictable. I've been in combat zones before, Okafor said simply. I need to see it with my own eyes. Dr. Tanaka stepped forward. I'd like to interview civilians from both sides. Not leaders or officials, just ordinary people. Families, workers, anyone willing to talk. Marcus Webb was the last to speak. And I want to talk to the lowest-ranking soldiers. The ones nobody pays attention to. The privates, the maintenance crews, the people at the bottom. Zilenth exchanged glances with his fellow council members. These requests were bizarre by their standards. What could ordinary people possibly tell them that the strategic analysis had not already revealed? But they had invited the humans precisely because traditional methods had failed. Very well, he said. We will arrange all of this. Though I am curious, Mr. Webb, why specifically the low-ranking soldiers? Webb smiled slightly. Because officers fight for strategy and ideology. The people at the bottom fight because they're told to. If you want to understand a war, talk to the people who can't escape it. Over the next 2 weeks, the human team scattered across council space. Colonel Okafor suited up in protective gear and traveled to 3 different combat zones. He walked through the ruins of a Vathara colony. The crystal structures shattered like broken glass. He stood on a Krell world where bioorganic buildings had been burned to the ground, leaving behind a smell like rotting meat. He watched through long-range scopes as battles played out in the empty spaces between worlds. What struck him most was the waste of it all. The Vathara fought with precision and grace, their tactics elegant even in destruction. The Krell fought with adaptive ferocity, their strategies evolving in real time. Both were skilled, both were brave, and both were dying for absolutely nothing that Okafor could see. He submitted his reports each night, his voice tired. It's not like any war I've seen before. There's no objective, no territory they're really trying to hold. They're just killing each other because that's what they do, like it's become more important than living. Dr. Tanaka's interviews were conducted in refugee centers and temporary shelters. She spoke to Vathara who had fled the fighting, their crystalline bodies scarred and dulled. She spoke to Krell who had lost their hive collectives, isolated individuals trying to survive alone. Through translators, she asked them about their lives, their families, their hopes. What she found disturbed her deeply. When she asked the refugees why the war started, most of them did not know. They knew it was important. They knew the enemy was wrong somehow, but the actual cause had been lost to time. What they knew was that their parents had fought and their grandparents before them. The war was not just a conflict. It was tradition. It's generational trauma on a civilizational scale, she reported. Neither side knows how to exist without the war. It's become part of their identity. They're Vathara who fight Krell, or Krell who fight Vathara. Without that, they don't know who they are. Marcus Webb's approach was different. He used his street-learned skills to find the soldiers nobody cared about. The maintenance workers who repaired ships between battles, the supply specialists who never got glory, the wounded who were recovering in medical facilities. He talked to them not as an authority figure but as someone who understood what it meant to be forgotten. In a Krell medical station, he met a soldier named Thresh. The Krell had lost 3 limbs in a battle and was growing new ones, a process that took months. Thresh was bitter and angry and at first refused to talk to the strange human, but Webb was patient. He came back day after day, sometimes just sitting in silence. Finally, Thresh spoke. "Why are you here, human? You do not understand our war." "Maybe not," Webb admitted. "But I understand being tired. And you look tired." Thresh made a sound that the translator interpreted as bitter laughter. "Tired? Yes, I am tired of fighting. Tired of killing. Tired of watching my unit die and getting replaced and dying again. But I cannot stop. To stop is to betray everything my bloodline has fought for." "What if your bloodline is wrong?" Webb asked quietly. Thresh did not answer. But something shifted in the Krell's eyes. In a Vathara facility on the other side of the front, Webb had a similar conversation with an engineer named Lyra Shan. She had been injured when her ship was destroyed, and now she spent her days repairing equipment that would be used to destroy more Krell ships. "Do you believe in the war?" Webb asked her. Lyra Shan was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was like wind chimes. "I believe in my people. I believe the Krell are wrong. But if you ask me why they are wrong, I cannot answer. I only know that they are. It is what I have been taught since I was small." "What if you were taught wrong?" "Then everything I am is a lie," Lyra Shan said. and there was such pain in her voice that Webb felt it physically. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen worked through the archives. Terabytes of data, centuries of history. The council had given her everything as requested, and she spent her days cross-referencing cultural materials with historical records. She was looking for something specific, though she could not have explained what until she found it. It was buried deep in both archives in records that were nearly 900 cycles old. References to a first contact. Not the war, but before the war. There were fragments of diplomatic exchanges, cultural gifts, even what looked like trade agreements. The Vithara and Krell had met peacefully. They had talked, exchanged information, even seemed to be building toward a formal alliance. And then within a single generation, everything fell apart. But the details were missing. Both sides had records from before the war and during the war, but almost nothing from the transition period. It was as if someone had deliberately erased those years from history. Chen dug deeper, using search algorithms that looked for patterns rather than specific content. She found references, tiny fragments that mentioned the incident or the betrayal or the day everything changed, but no details. Just echoes of something terrible. She brought her findings to the others. They gathered in a conference room aboard the Persistent Hope, comparing notes. They don't know why they're fighting, Tanaka said. Or at least the ordinary people don't. They just know they hate each other. The military leadership knows, Okafor added. Or they think they do. But when I tried to get specifics, they gave me propaganda instead of facts. It's like the truth has been buried under 800 years of mythology. Because it has been, Chen said, displaying her findings. Something happened during first contact. Something bad enough to start a war. But both sides have systematically erased the actual details. All that's left is the hate. Webb leaned back in his chair. I've seen this before. Not on this scale, but the pattern is the same. Gang wars back home that kept going because nobody remembered what started them. The original beef gets lost, but the bodies pile up. After a while, the war itself becomes the reason for fighting. So what do we do? Tanaka asked. Chen looked at the data, then at her team. We need to understand what happened. Find the truth that both sides have been hiding. Because I don't think we can end this war until we know how it really started. Shil-Enth listened to their preliminary report with growing unease. What you are suggesting is that both civilizations are lying to themselves. Not lying exactly, Chen said. More like, they've built their entire identities around a version of history that might not be true, or might be so distorted that it's functionally false. And you believe finding this truth will somehow end the war? Shil-Enth sounded skeptical. No, Chen said. But I think it's a necessary first step. Right now, both sides are fighting for what they think is an eternal truth. If we can show them that their truth is actually just old pain that nobody bothered to heal, maybe we can give them permission to stop. The council observers looked at each other. It was a strange theory, so different from the logical diplomatic approaches they had tried. But then, everything about the human approach was strange. How long will you need? Shil-Enth asked. Chen looked at her team. We've been here 2 weeks and we've barely scratched the surface. This is going to take time, months, maybe longer. Beings are dying every day, one of the observers said. I know, Chen said, and her voice was heavy. Believe me, I know. But if we rush this, if we try to force a peace before anyone is ready, it'll fall apart the moment we leave. We need to do this right. Marcus Webb spoke up. We've made some contacts. Soldiers on both sides who are tired of fighting. They're scared to say it out loud, but they want this to end. Maybe we can work with them. Build something from the bottom up while the doctors work on the big picture. It was not what the council had expected. They had hoped the humans would arrive, apply some unknown technique, and solve the problem quickly. Instead, the humans were talking about long-term cultural work, about building grassroots movements, about healing trauma that was centuries old. But they had no better ideas, so they agreed to let the humans continue. On the front lines, the war ground on. Ships exploded, worlds burned. But in a medical facility, a Krell soldier named Thresh was starting to think that maybe the human had a point. And in a repair bay, a Vithara engineer named Lirashan was beginning to question everything she had been taught. Small changes, tiny cracks in an edifice of hate that had stood for 847 cycles. But cracks nonetheless. 3 months into the mission, the human team had spread across the war zone like roots searching for water. They worked in ways the Galactic Council found increasingly difficult to understand. There were no grand diplomatic summits, no carefully worded treaties. Instead, the humans seemed to be collecting stories. Dr. Chen barely slept anymore. Her quarters aboard the Fulcrum were covered in displays showing interconnected data, lines of analysis spreading across the walls like neural pathways. She had developed an obsession with the missing years, that gap in history where peace had somehow transformed into war. Every night she dove deeper into the archives, looking for pieces of a puzzle that someone had deliberately scattered. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. station time. Chen was reviewing what appeared to be a Vethara children's story from 890 cycles ago. It was a simple tale about cooperation and understanding between different crystal formations. Nothing remarkable except that one of the characters in the story was described as the metal friend. Metal friend. The Vethara were crystalline. They had no metal in their biology. But the Krell were biomechanical. They integrated metal into their organic structures. Chen pulled up every children's story she could find from that era. Krell stories too, and there buried in the mythology of both species were echoes of friendship. Vethara stories about the adaptive ones who learned. Krell stories about the singing crystals who taught. They had not always been enemies. They had been friends first. Chen called an emergency meeting. The team gathered, looking tired. Colonel Okafor had just returned from his 5th visit to the combat zones. Dr. Tanaka had been conducting interviews for 18 hours straight. Marcus Webb had been traveling between a dozen different facilities, building trust with soldiers and civilians. "I found it," Chen said without preamble, "the missing piece. They were allies before they were enemies." She displayed the stories, the fragments of cultural memory. Both species have mythology about the other that predates the war. Not as enemies, but as friends, partners, maybe even close ones. Something happened to destroy that friendship, and both sides have spent centuries trying to erase the memory of it ever existing. "Why would they do that?" Tanaka asked. "Because remembering would make the war harder to justify," Webb said quietly. "If you're going to hate someone for 800 years, you can't let yourself remember that you used to love them." Okafor leaned forward. "So what happened? What turned friends into this?" Chen pulled up her analysis of the transition period. "I've been using linguistic analysis on the few fragments that remain. There are references to the misunderstanding, the insult, the betrayal. But here's what's interesting. Vethara sources blame the Krell for the betrayal. Krell sources blame the Vethara, and both describe almost the exact same incident from opposite perspectives." She showed them a reconstructed timeline. 894 cycles ago, there was a formal diplomatic meeting. First contact protocols, exchange of cultural customs, and something went catastrophically wrong during a greeting ceremony. "A greeting ceremony?" Okafor sounded incredulous. "They've been killing each other for 900 years over a handshake?" "Essentially, yes," Chen said. "The Krell have a greeting ritual that involves a specific pattern of limb movements. It's supposed to demonstrate trust and non-aggression, but to the Vethara, those exact same movements are a threat display. It's how they warn others before attacking." The room fell silent. Everyone was processing the implications. "So the Krell were trying to say hello," Tanaka said slowly, "and the Vethara thought they were being threatened. And the Vethara responded defensively," Chen continued, "which the Krell interpreted as an unprovoked attack. Within days, there was a skirmish. Within months, a war. And within a generation, both sides had rewritten their histories to make the other into eternal enemies rather than admit the whole thing started with a translation error." Webb let out a long breath. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." "It's also our way forward," Chen said. "If we can prove this, if we can show both sides that their eternal war is built on a mistake, maybe we can give them a way out. A way to stop fighting without admitting weakness." "They'll never believe it," Okafor said. "You're talking about overturning 900 years of history, of identity. That's not just changing minds, that's destroying entire worldviews. That's why we don't start at the top," Webb said. "We start with the people who are already questioning. The soldiers I've been talking to, the ones who are tired, they're ready to hear this." Meanwhile, Dr. Tanaka's interviews had revealed a pattern that was both heartbreaking and illuminating. She had spoken to 3 generations of Vethara from the same family line. The oldest, a matriarch who had survived 200 cycles, spoke of the Krell with absolute certainty. They were evil, treacherous, fundamentally wrong in their existence. When Tanaka asked why, the matriarch cited ancient texts and cultural memory. Her daughter, middle-aged by Vithara standards, spoke with less certainty. She hated the Krell because that was what she had been taught, because her mother told her stories of Krell atrocities, because the war was simply a fact of life. But when pressed, she admitted she had never actually met a Krell outside of combat. Her granddaughter, barely into adulthood, was different. She spoke about the war with a kind of exhausted resignation. I fight because everyone fights. Because if I do not, I am a traitor. But I do not understand why we fight. Nobody can tell me why, not really. Just that we must. Tanaka found the same pattern among the Krell. The older generation spoke with certainty born of lifelong indoctrination. The younger generations fought because they were told to, but the fire of hatred burned less bright in them. They were tired of a war they did not start and could not end. The hate is weakest in the young, Tanaka reported, which makes sense. They're further removed from whatever the original cause was, but they're also trapped by it. They can't imagine peace because they've never known it. The war is like gravity to them, just a fundamental law of existence. Okafor's observations from the front lines supported this. He had noticed that the fighting had become almost ritualized in places. There were unwritten rules, unofficial truces that both sides respected. Medical ships were not targeted. Civilian evacuation routes were left open. It was as if both militaries knew on some level that they were fighting for theater rather than victory. They're going through the motions, he said. Don't get me wrong, people are still dying. But there's no strategic objective anymore. I talked to a Vithara commander who admitted they'd been fighting over the same star system for 40 years, taking it and losing it in cycles. When I asked why they didn't just bypass it, he looked confused. It's a strategic position, he said. But when I asked what they were positioning for, he couldn't answer. The pattern was clear. The war continued not because anyone wanted it, but because no one knew how to stop it. It had become self-sustaining, a cultural perpetual motion machine fueled by momentum and fear. Webb's work with individual soldiers was where the theory met reality. He had built genuine relationships with dozens of fighters on both sides. They trusted him because he did not try to convince them of anything. He just listened. Thresh, the wounded Krell soldier, had become something close to a friend. Webb visited regularly, sometimes bringing food that the Krell found palatable, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. One day, Thresh asked him a question. Your people fought wars, yes? On your world? Yes, Webb said. Lots of them. For thousands of years. How did you stop? Webb considered the question carefully. We got tired, and we got scared. We built weapons that could destroy our entire world, and we realized that if we kept fighting, we'd all die. So we stepped back. Not all at once, not perfectly, but slowly, we built something different. But how? Thresh's voice was almost desperate. How do you unlearn hate? How do you stop when stopping feels like betrayal? You start small, Webb said. You find one person on the other side who feels the same way you do. Just one, and you talk to them. Not about the war, not about politics. Just about being alive. About being tired. About wanting something different. And then you find another person. And another, until there's enough of you that you can start imagining a different future. Thresh was quiet for a long time. Then, I think I would like to meet a Vithara who is tired of fighting. I think I can arrange that, Webb said. On the Vithara side, Lirishan had asked him a similar question. Is peace possible? Truly possible? Yes, Webb said. But it's harder than war. War is easy. You just point at the enemy and pull the trigger. Peace requires you to look at yourself, to question everything you believe, to admit you might have been wrong. That's terrifying. I am terrified, Lirishan admitted. I am terrified that all the friends I have lost, all the pain I have endured might be for nothing. That we might be fighting over a mistake our ancestors made. That fear is the first step, Webb said gently. You're already braver than you think. The human team reconvened to share their findings. The picture that emerged was both clearer and more complicated than they had hoped. The war had three main components. First, the original cause was indeed a tragic misunderstanding, a greeting ritual misinterpreted, leading to a cascade of retaliation and counter-retaliation. The truth had been buried under centuries of propaganda and selective history. Second, the war had become identity. Both civilizations had built their cultures around conflict. Their heroes were warriors. Their coming-of-age rituals involved military service. Their economies were war economies. Peace was not just unfamiliar. It was existentially threatening. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there were people on both sides who wanted it to end. Not leaders, not yet, but ordinary beings who were tired of fighting and dying for reasons they did not understand. These people were scattered, isolated, afraid to speak openly, but they existed. So here's what we do, Chen said, laying out the plan. We need 2 parallel tracks. At the top level, we need to work on revealing the historical truth. Build an academic case that's so thoroughly researched that even the leadership can't dismiss it. That's going to take time and careful political maneuvering. At the ground level, Webb continued, we build a grassroots movement. Connect the tired soldiers, the questioning civilians, give them a space to talk, to realize they're not alone. Start building a culture of peace from the bottom up. And we need to address the identity crisis, Tanaka added. Both civilizations need to reimagine themselves as something other than warriors. That means finding new heroes, new stories, new ways of understanding who they are. Okafor nodded. The military angle is tricky. A lot of officers have never known anything but war. They're not going to give up their power easily. But there are cracks there too. Veterans with PTSD, commanders who are tired of sending young soldiers to die. If we can reach them, show them that they can be honored for bringing peace instead of waging war, we might get somewhere. It was ambitious. It was probably impossible, but it was the only plan they had. Zil-Enth listened to their proposal with a mixture of hope and skepticism. What you are suggesting will take years, perhaps decades. The council expected a faster resolution. The council expected magic, Chen said bluntly. We're offering actual solutions. They're slow because we're dealing with cultural trauma that's 900 years deep. You can't fix that overnight. And what if it fails? Zil-Enth asked. What if you reveal this truth and it changes nothing? Then at least we tried something that hadn't been tried before, Chen said. Look, Ambassador, I've studied conflicts my entire career. I've seen wars end and I've seen them continue. The ones that continue do so because nobody addresses the underlying causes. Everyone focuses on the violence instead of the pain that causes the violence. You want to stop the war? You have to heal the trauma. There's no shortcut. Zil-Enth looked at the human team, these strange beings who approached problems so differently from any council species. They were messy and emotional and frustratingly slow in their methods. But they were also the first people who had given him genuine hope in a very long time. Very well, he said. You have the council's support. Do what you need to do. That night, Webb sent a carefully encrypted message to Thresh. I have someone I'd like you to meet. Another soldier who's tired of fighting. Are you willing? The reply came hours later. Just one word. Yes. In another facility, Lira-shan received a similar message. Her reply was the same. Yes, small steps. Tiny movements toward a peace that seemed impossible. But every journey, no matter how long, starts with a single step. And humanity had always been good at impossible journeys. The council's reaction was immediate and explosive. When Dr. Chen presented her proposal for an unauthorized civilian gathering on Last Hope, a shattered planet in the neutral zone, 3 different ambassadors stood up at once to object. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of translated voices, each species trying to make themselves heard over the others. You want to smuggle 200 civilians into a war zone? Councillor Thrain's voice boomed over the others. This is madness. It is dangerous. It violates at least 7 different treaties. We're not smuggling them, Marcus Webb said calmly. We're facilitating a meeting. The civilians are volunteering. You have convinced 100 Krell and 100 Vithara to meet face to face? Councillor Vree's feathers were fully extended in agitation. How? Both governments have standing orders to execute anyone who fraternizes with the enemy. We convinced them that peace is worth the risk, Dr. Tanaka said. And we promised them protection, which means we need to actually protect them. Zil-Enth held up his hands for quiet. The chamber slowly settled, though the tension remained thick. This is highly irregular. If either government discovers what you are planning, it could be seen as an act of war against the council itself. They could claim we are kidnapping their citizens. They could, Chen agreed, or they could ignore it. From what we've learned, both governments are aware that their populations are war-weary. They just can't acknowledge it publicly without looking weak. If we give them plausible deniability, if this appears to be a rogue human operation, they might choose to look the other way. And if they do not? Zil-Enth asked. If they send military forces to retrieve their citizens, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Colonel Okafor said. But I don't think they will. Both militaries are stretched thin. They're fighting a war on multiple fronts. The last thing they want is to open a new conflict with the Council by attacking a neutral station. The debate continued for hours. In the end, it came down to a simple question that Silenth posed. If we do nothing, what happens? The chamber was silent. Everyone knew the answer. The war would continue. Beings would keep dying. The conflict would keep spreading. Nothing would change. If we allow this, Silenth said slowly, the Council must have complete deniability. This is a human operation. We provided facilities because we are humanitarian. We knew nothing about the specific participants or their intentions. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Chen said, and there might have been a slight smile on her face. Then you have 48 hours to complete whatever you are planning. After that, the Council will officially become aware of the situation and will be forced to intervene. It was as close to a blessing as they were going to get. The logistics were complex. Webb had been building his network of tired soldiers and questioning civilians for months. He had identified individuals on both sides who were willing to take enormous risks for even a chance at peace. Now he had to get them all to last hope without either government noticing. Thresh was the first Krell to arrive. The soldier had healed enough to travel, though 2 of the regenerated limbs were still weak. Webb met the transport personally, watching as Thresh emerged into the abandoned hangar that would serve as their meeting space. How many? Thresh asked. 100 of your people, Webb said. 100 Vithara. All volunteers. All tired of fighting. Thresh looked around the empty hangar. This is insane. Yes, Webb agreed. But you're here anyway. I am here because I am tired of watching my unit die, Thresh said quietly. I am tired of killing beings I do not know for reasons I do not understand. I am tired of being tired. Over the next day, the others arrived in small groups. Transport ships that officially carried supplies or medical personnel instead carried passengers who had made an impossible choice. To defy their governments. To meet their enemies. To try something that might get them killed. Lyra Shan arrived on one of the last transports. When she stepped out and saw Thresh standing nearby, she stopped moving. For a long moment, the Vithara and the Krell just stared at each other. 847 cycles of hate stood between them, represented by 2 tired soldiers who had lost too much to the war. You are the one Marcus told me about, Lyra Shan said, her voice like wind chimes in a storm. Yes, Thresh replied. You are the engineer, I am. Another long silence. Then Lyra Shan said something that made the human observers hold their breath. I do not hate you. I am supposed to hate you. I have been taught to hate you since I was formed. But standing here looking at you, I feel only tired. I feel the same, Thresh said. I am supposed to want you dead. Instead, I want to understand why we are enemies. It was not friendship. It was not even peace. But it was a beginning. The first gathering was chaos. 200 beings who had been raised to see each other as monsters were now in the same room. The humans had arranged the space carefully, with Vithara and Krell segregated at first, giving them time to adjust. But even separated, the tension was overwhelming. Dr. Chen stood at the center of the hangar, which had been converted into a makeshift auditorium. She spoke through translators, her voice calm and steady. Thank you all for coming. I know what you have risked to be here. I know that everything you have been taught says this is wrong, that the beings across this room are your enemies. But I want to start by asking you a question. Who among you can tell me why this war started? The silence was heavy. Chen waited. Finally, a young Krell soldier raised a limb. The Vithara betrayed us. They attacked during a peace ceremony. A Vithara civilian immediately responded. That is a lie. The Krell threatened us. We defended ourselves. Other voices joined in, each side insisting they knew the truth. The noise level rose. Arguments broke out. For a moment it looked like violence might erupt. Stop, Chen said, not loudly but with authority. The room quieted. You are both right. And you are both wrong. She pulled up the holographic display. For the next hour she walked them through the research her team had compiled. The evidence of early friendship between the species, the cultural artifacts that showed cooperation, the linguistic analysis of the transition period, and finally, the reconstruction of what actually happened during first contact. You have been fighting for 847 cycles because your ancestors misunderstood each other, Chen said. A greeting ritual was mistaken for a threat. Pride prevented anyone from admitting the mistake, and over time, the truth was buried under layers of propaganda and selective history until nobody remembered what really happened. You have been dying for a translation error. The room was utterly silent. Chen could see the disbelief, the anger, the dawning horror on faces both crystalline and biomechanical. She pressed on. I know this is hard to hear. I know it makes all the pain, all the loss feel meaningless. But it is not meaningless. Every being who died in this war was real. Every sacrifice was genuine. The tragedy is not that they died for nothing. The tragedy is that they died for a lie, and that lie has been perpetuated by both of your governments because it was easier than admitting a mistake. A Vithara elder stood up. You expect us to believe this? To accept that centuries of teaching, of cultural memory are wrong? I expect you to look at the evidence, Chen said. All of it is available for your review. We have not hidden anything. And then I expect you to make your own choice. You can reject this truth and go back to fighting. Or you can accept it and start building something different. The gathering broke apart into smaller groups. For a while, chaos reigned. Some beings retreated into their separate corners, refusing to engage. Others began to examine the evidence, arguing over the interpretation of ancient texts. A very few, began to talk across species lines. Dr. Tanaka worked the room, facilitating conversations, preventing fights from escalating. She had brought materials with her, videos and documents from Earth's own history. She showed them footage from Rwanda, where Hutus and Tutsis had killed each other by the hundreds of thousands over manufactured ethnic divisions. She showed them the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from South Africa, where victims and perpetrators sat together to heal. My species understands generational trauma, Tanaka told a mixed group. We have inflicted it on ourselves repeatedly. What we have learned painfully and slowly is that trauma cannot be healed with more violence. It can only be healed with truth and with time. Colonel Okafor shared his own experiences. I served in peacekeeping forces that tried to stop wars in places where people had been killing each other for generations. Sometimes we succeeded. More often we failed. But I learned something important. Peace does not come from the top down. It comes from people like you. Ordinary beings who are tired of fighting, deciding that there has to be a better way. The real breakthrough came on the third day. The group had been together for 72 hours, and the humans had structured the time carefully. First, shared meals where Vithara and Krell could sit near each other without being forced to interact. Then group activities that required minimal cooperation, building things together, solving problems, simple tasks that showed they could coexist. Then they screened a documentary. The humans had put together footage from both sides of the war. Not propaganda, but reality. Civilian casualties, destroyed homes, children crying, soldiers dying. They showed the same battles from both perspectives, demonstrating how each side saw themselves as victims and the other as aggressors. It was brutal. Several beings left the room, but most stayed, watching in growing horror as the full scope of the war's devastation was laid bare. When it ended, Thresh stood up. The Krell soldier moved to the center of the room into the space between the two groups. I have killed 43 Vithara, Thresh said. In combat, following orders, doing my duty. I believed I was protecting my people, but watching this, I realized I was not protecting anyone. I was just adding to the pile of bodies. Thresh looked at the Vithara side of the room. I cannot undo what I have done. I cannot bring back the beings I have killed. But I can stop killing. I can choose to not add any more death to this war. And I am asking you, all of you, to make the same choice. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lyra Shan stood up. She walked across the room, crossing the invisible line that separated the species. She stopped in front of Thresh. I have repaired ships that killed Krell, she said. I have enabled the deaths of thousands. I told myself I was serving my people, but I was serving this war. And I am done serving death. She extended her crystalline hand. Thresh looked at it, then reached out with a biomechanical limb. Their hands touched. The room exploded, not with violence but with emotion. Vithara and Krell began moving toward each other, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Some were crying. Others were angry, shouting about betrayal and treason. But many, so many, were simply reaching out to touch someone they had been taught to hate. and finding that hate was harder to maintain when you looked into someone's eyes. It was not peace, not yet. It was just 200 beings deciding that they were tired of war. But it was enough. Marcus Webb watched from the side of the room, his eyes wet. Dr. Chen stood next to him. "Think it will spread?" he asked. "It has to," Chen said. "We've given them the spark. Now we need to help them build the fire." The human team knew they had maybe another day before the council would be forced to officially intervene. They worked through the night helping the participants draft a joint statement. It was not a treaty. It was not a formal agreement. It was simply a declaration from 200 beings who represented no one but themselves. We are tired of fighting. We are tired of dying. We are tired of hating. We do not speak for our governments or our militaries. We speak only for ourselves. And we say that this war must end. Not tomorrow, not in some distant future, but now. We will not fight anymore. We will not kill anymore. And we invite others on both sides to join us in choosing life over death. They transmitted the statement on open channels. Within hours, it was everywhere. Both governments immediately denounced it as treason. They declared the participants to be traitors and criminals. Arrest warrants were issued. But they did not send military forces to Last Hope. Because by then, the statement had been seen by millions. And many of those millions were thinking the same thing the 200 had thought. Maybe there is another way. The council emergency session was predictably chaotic. Selenth stood at the podium, defending the human team against accusations of interference and unlawful manipulation. But his defense was half-hearted at best, because he was watching the same transmissions everyone else was watching. The statement had triggered something. On Vithara world, soldiers were refusing orders. On Krell stations, entire units were declaring themselves neutral. It was not organized. It was not coordinated. But it was happening. The war was not over. There were still hardliners, still believers, still those who would fight to the last. But for the first time in 847 cycles, there were also those who chose not to fight. And that choice, that simple human idea that peace was something you could just decide to have, was spreading like fire through a dry forest. 1 year after the Last Hope gathering, Ambassador Zilinth stood in the same council chamber where he had first proposed inviting humanity to mediate the war. The chamber was more crowded today. Representatives from both the Vethera Collective and the Krell Dominion sat in specially designated sections. The first time in 900 cycles that they had occupied the same room without trying to kill each other. It had not been an easy year. The path from that first gathering to this moment had been paved with setbacks, failures, and moments when it seemed like everything would fall apart. The first major crisis came 3 weeks after Last Hope. A Vithara hardline faction, refusing to accept the grassroots peace movement, launched a major offensive against a Krell colony world. The attack killed thousands and seemed designed specifically to reignite the full-scale war. The Krell military prepared for massive retaliation. Dr. Chen remembered the emergency call, the desperation in Zilinth's voice. "It is falling apart. Everything you built is collapsing." But then something unexpected happened. Krell soldiers who had been part of the peace movement refused to participate in the retaliation. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the counterattack was delayed while the Krell command structure struggled with what amounted to a mutiny. In that delay, Vethara peace activists broadcast their own condemnation of the hardline attack, making it clear that not all Vethara supported the violence. The Krell retaliation, when it finally came, was measured. Surgical strikes against military targets only, with warnings given to allow civilian evacuation. It was violence, but it was restrained violence. For the first time in centuries, one side had pulled their punches. "That is what gives me hope," Colonel Okafor had told the council. Not that the violence stopped completely, but that it was consciously limited. They chose restraint. That is how peace starts. The peace movement grew despite opposition from both governments, or perhaps because of it. The official denunciations and arrest warrants had backfired, making the movement seem more authentic and grassroots. Young Vethara and Krell began to see the peace activists as heroes defying corrupt leadership, rather than traitors betraying their people. Marcus Webb spent most of that year on the ground, helping to organize and protect the growing network of peace activists. It was dangerous work. 3 times he was nearly killed by hardliners. Once, a Vethara extremist tried to assassinate him during a public gathering. Lyra Shan, who had become one of the movement's most prominent voices, threw herself in front of the weapon. She survived, but the assassination attempt became a rallying cry. "They tried to kill a human who came to help us," Lirashan said from her medical bed, her crystalline body fractured but healing. "They tried to kill someone who asked for nothing except that we stop killing each other." What does that tell you about who really wants this war to continue? The image of a Vethara protecting a human from another Vethara spread across both civilizations. It became symbolic of the larger truth the peace movement represented. The lines were not drawn between species anymore. They were drawn between those who wanted peace and those who profited from war. Dr. Tanaka established what she called healing circles across both territories. These were gatherings where beings from both sides could share their trauma, their grief, their anger. It was hard work. Sessions often devolved into shouting matches or tears. But slowly, painfully, participants began to see each other not as monsters, but as fellow victims of a war nobody wanted. Generational trauma does not heal quickly, Tanaka reported to the council. We are dealing with beings whose great-great-grandparents were traumatized, who passed that trauma down through cultural memory. This will take generations to fully heal. But we can start the process. We can stop adding new trauma. The economic aspect of the war proved to be one of the hardest challenges. Both civilizations had built their entire economic systems around warfare. Weapons manufacturers, shipbuilders, military suppliers. All of these industries employed billions and generated vast wealth for the leadership. Peace threatened to collapse both economies. Dr. Chen worked with economists from a dozen council species to develop a transition plan. Convert weapons factories to civilian production, retrain soldiers for construction and infrastructure work, redirect military spending to rebuilding destroyed worlds. It was ambitious and would take decades to fully implement. But it gave both governments a roadmap for how peace could be economically viable. You cannot ask people to choose peace if peace means starvation, Chen explained to skeptical Vethara officials. You have to show them that peace can be prosperous, that there is life after war. The turning point came 6 months after Last Hope. Both governments, facing massive popular pressure and the threat of military mutiny, agreed to preliminary peace talks. Not negotiations to end the war, they insisted, but discussions about potentially discussing a framework for dialogue. It was bureaucratic doublespeak, a way for both sides to engage without admitting they were backing down. The humans did not care what they called it. The preliminary talks lasted 3 months and nearly collapsed a dozen times. Every session revealed new layers of grievance, new reasons why peace was impossible. The Vethara demanded acknowledgement of Krell crimes. The Krell demanded the same from the Vethara. Both wanted apologies that the other refused to give. "This is not working," the Vethara chief diplomat said during a break. "We are going in circles." "Then stop trying to win," Chen said bluntly. "This is not a negotiation where one side gets everything and the other gets nothing. This is about finding a way to coexist. Both of you need to accept that you will not get justice for every wrong. You will not receive punishment for every crime. Because if you insist on that, this war will never end." The breakthrough came when Thresh and Lirashan were invited to address the negotiations. They did not speak as diplomats or representatives. They spoke as survivors. "I cannot give back the lives I took," Thresh said. "No apology will resurrect the dead. No treaty will undo 900 cycles of suffering. But I can stop adding to the death toll. I can choose to not kill anymore. And I am asking both of our governments to make the same choice." Lirashan spoke of the cost of war. "We measure victories in territory gained and ships destroyed. But the real cost is measured in the beings who will never return home, in the children who grew up without parents, in the worlds that are now lifeless rocks, in the future we destroyed for a past nobody even remembers correctly." The delegates listened in silence. These were not politicians speaking. These were people who had bled for the war and were asking for it to end. After that, the tone of the negotiations changed. Slowly, incrementally, both sides began to move from demands to discussions, from accusations to acknowledgments. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a willingness to consider that maybe, possibly, there could be another way. The Treaty of New Beginning, as it came to be called, was signed 9 months after the Last Hope gathering. It was not a surrender. It was not even a peace treaty in the traditional sense. It was an agreement to stop fighting, to establish neutral zones, to begin the long process of healing. Both governments insisted that they were not admitting defeat or acknowledging wrongdoing. They were simply choosing to pursue their interests through diplomatic rather than military means. It was face-saving language that let them end the war without looking weak. The humans did not care about the language. They cared about the result. The signing ceremony was held on Last Hope, now officially renamed New Beginning. The symbolism was intentional. This was the place where 200 ordinary beings had decided to choose peace. Now their governments were following their lead. The ceremony was not grand. There were no military displays or elaborate rituals. Just two representatives signing a document that said, in essence, "We agree to stop killing each other and to try talking instead." But for the first time in 847 cycles, Vethara and Krell ships sat side by side without firing. For the first time in 900 years, beings from both species stood in the same room without violence. It was not peace. Not yet. It was an armistice, a ceasefire, a tentative agreement that war was not the only option, but it was a beginning. Shilanth looked at the human delegation seated in the council chamber. They looked exhausted. Dr. Chen had lost weight. Colonel Okafor moved like someone carrying invisible wounds. Dr. Tanaka had dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Marcus Webb's hands showed scars from incidents he never talked about. They had given a year of their lives to this. They had risked death, faced assassination attempts, endured failures and setbacks, and they had succeeded where the entire Galactic Council had failed for 900 cycles. On behalf of the Galactic Council, Shilanth said formally, "I present humanity with our highest honor, the Star of Unity, awarded only 3 times in our history, for service to galactic peace that exceeds all expectation." The chamber erupted in the various sounds that different species made to show approval. Applause, harmonics, resonant humming. The human team stood looking uncomfortable with the attention. "We also extend to humanity a permanent seat on the Galactic Council," Shilanth continued, "no longer as observers but as full members. Your species has demonstrated wisdom beyond your years and compassion beyond measure." Dr. Chen stepped forward to accept. She looked at the assembled representatives, then at the Vethara and Krell sections of the chamber. "Thank you for this honor. But I need to make something clear. The treaty that was signed today is not the end. It is the beginning. Peace is not a destination that you reach and then relax. Peace is a practice. It is something you have to work at every day." She gestured to the Vethara and Krell delegates. Both of these civilizations are going to struggle with this transition. They have defined themselves by war for so long that they do not know how to define themselves by peace. There will be setbacks. There will be incidents. There will be factions on both sides that reject the treaty and try to restart the fighting. "We know," said the Vethara delegate quietly. "We are prepared," added the Krell representative. Chen nodded. "Then prepare for it to be harder than you think. Prepare for moments when you want to give up. Prepare for people questioning whether peace was worth the cost, because there will be cost. Transitioning from a war economy to a peace economy will be painful. Confronting the truth about your own history will be uncomfortable. Learning to coexist with beings you were taught to hate will require constant effort." She paused, then continued in a softer voice. "But it is possible. My species is proof of that. We spent 10,000 years killing each other. We built weapons that could destroy our entire planet. We committed atrocities that still haunt us. But we stepped back from the edge. Not perfectly. Not completely. We still have conflicts, still have violence. But we are not destroying ourselves anymore. And if we could do it, you can too." The ceremony concluded with a symbolic gesture. Thresh and Lirashan, representing the grassroots peace movement that had forced the governments to act, placed the first stone of a memorial on New Beginning. It would be a monument to all the lives lost in the war, Vethara and Krell names side by side, acknowledging that all the dead were victims, regardless of which side they fought on. As the stone was placed, both species observed a moment of silence. In that silence there was grief for what had been lost, but there was also hope for what could be built. The human delegation prepared to return to Earth. They had been away for a year, and they were ready to go home. But before they left, Shilanth met with them privately. "I wanted to thank you," he said, not officially but personally. "When I proposed inviting humanity, I thought perhaps you might see something we had missed. I never imagined you would transform the entire situation." "We did not transform it," Chen said. "Thresh, Lirashan, and 200 others like them transformed it. We just gave them the tools and the permission. That is still more than anyone else managed, Silenth replied. I am curious, though. How did you know it would work? When you proposed the last Hope Gathering, you had no guarantee that Vethara and Krell could sit in the same room without killing each other. Chen smiled slightly. We did not know it would work, we hoped. That is what my species does best, Ambassador. We hope stubbornly, even when logic says we should give up. We believe that beings are capable of change, even when they have spent centuries proving otherwise. Some people call it optimism. Others call it foolishness. We call it being human. Colonel Okafor added, Every peace humanity has ever achieved started with someone hoping it was possible. The big trick is not giving up when it looks impossible. Will you continue to help? Silenth asked. The Vethara and Krell will need support for generations. We will send advisors, counselors, economists, anyone who can help, Dr. Tanaka said. But the real work has to be done by them. We can show them the path, but they have to walk it. We will, said a voice from the doorway. It was the Krell delegate accompanied by the Vethara representative. They had arrived unannounced together. We know the road ahead will be difficult, the Vethara said. Already there are those who call us traitors, who say we have betrayed our ancestors by ending the war. But there are more who are relieved, the Krell added. More who are tired of fighting, more who want to build instead of destroy. The humans taught us something important. They taught us that change is possible, even when it seems impossible. Marcus Webb stood up from where he had been sitting quietly. Just remember one thing. Peace is not the absence of conflict. People will still disagree. There will still be tensions. The difference is that you talk through problems instead of shooting through them. It is messier, slower, and more frustrating than war, but nobody dies while you are talking, the delegates nodded. They understood, at least intellectually. The real understanding would come with time and practice. As the UNSS Persistent Hope prepared to depart, Marcus Webb stood in the observation deck, looking back at New Beginning. The memorial construction was visible from orbit, a growing structure that would eventually be seen from space. Young Vethara and Krell worked side by side on it, building something together instead of destroying. Dr. Chen joined him. Think it will stick? She asked. Webb was quiet for a moment. There will be setbacks, probably a few serious ones. In 5 years, maybe 10, there will be an incident. Some hothead will kill someone from the other side, and people will say the peace was a mistake. Both governments will be tempted to go back to war because at least war is familiar. Reassuring, Chen said dryly. But, Webb continued, there are thousands of Thresh and Lyrishon now, beings who have met the enemy and found people instead of monsters. You cannot unlearn that. Once you have seen the other side as people, it is harder to kill them. Not impossible, but harder. And every year that passes without war makes peace a little more normal, a little more accepted. Chen looked at the memorial taking shape on the planet below. We gave them a chance. That is all. The rest is up to them. That is all anyone can do, Webb said. Give people a chance and hope they take it. The persistent hope jumped to faster than light, leaving behind a galaxy that had been forever changed. Not fixed, not perfected, but changed. 2 civilizations that had been locked in eternal war were now trying something different. They were trying peace. It would not be easy. It would not be quick. But it was possible. And possibility, humanity had learned long ago, was the seed from which every great change grew. Back on Earth, the team was celebrated as heroes. There were parades, award ceremonies, interviews with every major news network. But the 4 of them found it exhausting. They had not done this for glory. They had done it because beings were dying, and someone needed to try something different. 6 months after their return, Dr. Chen received a message from New Beginning. It was from Thresh. The message was simple but profound. Dr. Chen, I wanted you to know that yesterday I met the family of a Vethara soldier I killed during the war. His name was Celestor, and he died in the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. His daughter wanted to meet me. I did not know if I could face her. I expected hatred, and I would have deserved it. But she told me she forgave me. She said that her father died in a war that should never have happened, and the best way to honor his memory was to make sure no one else died the same way. We cried together, a Krell and a Vethara, mourning someone we both lost to the madness of war. I thought you should know that the seeds you planted are growing. Thank you for giving us the chance to be more than killers. Chen read the message 3 times, her eyes wet. She forwarded it to the rest of the team with a single line added, "This is why we do it." 5 years after the Treaty of New Beginning, there was indeed a major incident. A Vithara freighter was destroyed by what appeared to be a Krell military vessel. The evidence seemed clear. For 48 hours, it looked like the war might restart. But then something remarkable happened. Instead of immediately retaliating, the Vithara government requested a joint investigation with Krell authorities. It took 3 weeks, but they discovered the truth. The attack had been carried out by hardline extremists from both species working together. They had hoped to reignite the war by faking an attack. The conspiracy was exposed. The perpetrators were arrested by their own governments, and the incident, rather than restarting the war, became proof that peace was stronger than the forces trying to destroy it. "We investigated instead of retaliating," the Krell Prime Minister announced. "That is what civilized beings do. We trusted the process the humans helped us build, and it worked." 10 years after the treaty, the first generation of Vithara and Krell who had never known war reached adulthood. They had grown up in peace, learning about the war in history classes rather than living through it. To them, the idea of killing Krell or Vithara seemed as foreign as humanity killing each other over skin color or national borders once had. A cultural exchange program sent young Vithara to study on Krell worlds and vice versa. Mixed crews began working on rebuilding projects. Slowly, tentatively, the two civilizations were learning to coexist. There were still problems. Economic integration proved difficult. Cultural misunderstandings led to tensions. Political extremists on both sides still called for a return to war. But every year, there were fewer of them and their voices grew quieter. 20 years after the treaty, Lirishan was elected to the Vithara Council as the first openly pro-peace candidate. Thresh became a decorated peacekeeper, traveling to other conflict zones to share the lessons learned from the Vithara-Krell War. They had become living symbols of what was possible when beings chose understanding over hatred. The Galactic Council, watching the transformation, began to apply human conflict resolution techniques to other disputes. Not every attempt succeeded. Some conflicts proved too entrenched, too complicated. But more often than not, the human approach of addressing underlying trauma, rather than just managing violence, proved effective. Humanity's reputation in the galaxy shifted. They were no longer seen as the chaotic newcomers, the violent species barely evolved past self-destruction. They became known as the peacemakers, the species that understood war so well they knew how to end it. Ambassador Zealanth, now serving his final term before retirement, often reflected on that first emergency session where he had proposed inviting humanity to help. It had been a desperate gamble, an acknowledgement that traditional methods had failed completely. "We approached the Vithara-Krell War as a problem to be solved with logic and leverage," he told new council members during their orientation. The humans understood it as a wound to be healed. That difference in perspective changed everything. They taught us that peace is not about treaties and territorial agreements. It is about helping traumatized beings remember how to trust again. 30 years after the treaty, the memorial on New Beginning was completed. It stood as the largest monument in known space, visible from orbit, bearing the names of every confirmed casualty from 900 years of war. 4 trillion names, each one representing a being who had lived and died in service of a conflict that should never have happened. At the dedication ceremony, speakers from both species addressed the gathered crowds, but the most moving moment came when a Vithara elder and a Krell veteran, both of whom had fought in the final battles before the ceasefire, stood together at the base of the memorial. "We cannot bring back the dead," the Vithara elder said. "We cannot undo the suffering, but we can promise them that their deaths were not in vain. We have learned, we have changed, and we will never forget what hatred cost us." The Krell veteran added, "To future generations we say this. Remember this memorial, remember these names, and remember that every one of them died because our ancestors chose violence over dialogue. Let that be the lesson you carry forward. Let that be the promise you keep." Back on Earth, the original team had gone their separate ways, but they stayed in touch. Dr. Chen continued teaching conflict resolution, training the next generation of peacemakers. Colonel Okafor worked with the UN, helping to mediate disputes on Earth and beyond. Dr. Tanaka ran a clinic specializing in trauma recovery, treating both humans and aliens. Marcus Webb returned to Chicago, but he traveled frequently to conflict zones across the galaxy, doing the quiet work of building trust between enemies. They were older now, graying and slower, but when they met for reunions, they would talk about New Beginning, about Thresh and Lyrashan, about the 200 beings who had risked everything for peace. "Do you think we really made a difference?" Webb asked during one such gathering. 4 trillion beings died in that war, Chen said. "In the 30 years since the treaty, 0 have died from Vathara-Krell violence. I would say we made a difference, but it is not perfect," Tanaka noted. "There are still tensions, still problems." "Peace is never perfect," Okafor said. "It is just better than the alternative." They raised their glasses in a toast. To possibility, to hope, to the stubborn belief that even the longest war can end if someone is brave enough to try. And in the space between worlds, on a planet that had been shattered by war and reborn as a symbol of peace, young Vathara and Krell played together in the shadow of a memorial to all the beings who had not lived to see this day. They did not understand, not really, what the monument represented. To them, Vathara and Krell had always been friends. The war was ancient history, something from before their time, and that perhaps was the greatest success of all. A generation that could not imagine war because they had only known peace. The UNSS Persistent Hope had long since been retired, its mission complete. But the hope it represented lived on. Hope that enemies could become friends. Hope that trauma could be healed. Hope that even after 900 years of darkness, light could find a way through. The Galactic Council had asked humanity for help ending a war. Humanity had given them something better. They had given them a future where war was not inevitable, where peace was not just the absence of violence, but the active choice to build something better. It was humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not technology or weapons or even wisdom, just the simple, stubborn belief that things could change, that beings could choose differently, that tomorrow did not have to look like yesterday. And slowly, world by world, species by species, that belief was spreading. The galaxy was learning what humanity had learned through millennia of painful experience, that peace was not weakness, that forgiveness was not surrender, that hope was not naive. Hope was the hardest work there was, but it was also the most important, and humanity, for all their flaws and chaos and emotional volatility, had mastered that particular art better than any species the galaxy had ever known. They had learned it in the ruins of their own wars. They had practiced it in the aftermath of their own atrocities. And now they were teaching it to a galaxy that desperately needed to learn. The war that had raged for 847 cycles was over. The peace that replaced it would require constant work for generations to come. But it was possible. And as long as it was possible, there was hope. And as long as there was hope, there was a future worth building.